You're listening to the Fertility Docs Uncensored podcast, featuring insight on all things fertility from some of the top-rated doctors around America. Whether you're struggling to conceive or just planning for your future family, we're here to guide you every step of the way.
Hi, everyone. We're back with another episode of Fertility Docs Uncensored. I'm one of your hosts, Dr. Abby Eblen from Nashville Fertility Center. And today I'm joined by my friends, Dr. Susan Hudson from Texas Fertility Center.
Hello.
And Dr. Carrie Bedient from the Fertility Center of Las Vegas.
Hello.
Hey, guys. So we were just talking right before we got started. Since it's close to Halloween, we were kind of talking about funny stories that we had, tricks that we had played on people. Carrie, tell me about your trick that you played on somebody one time.
So when I was in college, there was a group of girls that I was friends with, and we had the one token male friend. And I lived on the I say first floor, but British first floor. So it was actually the second floor. And the 0 floor, or the ground floor, I should say, was nicknamed the Virgin Vault. And it was the only all-female floor on the entire campus.
So where'd you go to college, Carrie?
WashU in St. Louis.
Okay.
Oh, wow.
So we, group of girls, friends, we had our one token male, and he would occasionally do things that we did not approve of. Like at one point, the trick that he played on us was he broke into all of our rooms and stole our underwear, hung them up in his room across a clothesline. And we did not take kindly to this. So we
had to get him back.
We had to get him back. And so we took an entire thing of tampons and pads and strategically placed them in his room, in his clothes, in his backpack, in his really everything we could think of. And I still remember his face to this day when we had he happened to be in a choir, and we went to the Christmas concert, and he put his hand in his pocket and pulled out a tampon in the middle of the Christmas choir concert. Because of course that's what you do.
So I always like it when you stick your hand in your pocket and you find a 20, but you don't really want to find a tampon, much less if you're a guy.
Much less if you're a guy. Yeah. So that's what we did, which I guess should have been the clue right then that I was going to eventually become a gynecologist if I really thought about it. So
there you go. That was the tip off.
What sweet and innocent things has your face hidden, Abby? I know that there's a trick in there somewhere.
Well, let me just say, when we were talking about this, initially Carrie claimed that she had never played tricks on people. And I'm always known as being the rule follower. I never break the rules. But there are a few times when I did. And my story also was from college. We had a friend of ours who, same thing, she played a trick on us. And she was just a hilarious person anyway. And so my roommate and I decided that we were going to get her back. And so we were sitting there on a Saturday night in our dorm room with nothing better to do. And so we came up with this idea of popping a bunch of popcorn. So we popped and popped and popped, just bags and bags of popcorn. And our dorm the facing of the door was really wide. So the distance between the wall and the door, there was like probably about 3 inches of depth there. And so what we did is she went to bed really early at night. So we always stayed up late. So it was a Saturday night. So we kind of went sneaking down the hall. We took paper bags actually and basically papered the door up to the very top. And so there was just a small opening at the top of the door. So we were trying to be really quiet. So we were pouring popcorn, these bags of popcorn down in her door. So we kept pouring. So the door was like full of popcorn. So the next morning we were up early. And so we went to eat lunch. And so we thought, we'll just walk by and see if Terry's opened her door yet or anything. So we go by. And her door is completely perfect. There's not a bit of popcorn anywhere. The door is just completely, she's completely taken everything down. So we thought, well, we'll just knock on her door and just start talking to her. So we knocked on the door and she invited us in and, acted like she had no idea of anything going on. And so we all just started talking, and we were just talking about something that was going to happen in school the next day. And then she brought out this just giant wok of popcorn. She goes, yeah, just pop some popcorn. Would you guys like some of this? And so anyway, she kind of knew it was us. So we all started giggling. So it was kind of funny.
That's cute.
So Susan, what about you? Do you have any funny stories?
I am usually more the person who gets tricked than the tricker.
So have you been tricked then?
Like little things, not anything. I can't think of anything huge. So I am not, I appreciate nature, but when it comes to plants, like I'm relatively clueless. You know, I think you're like,
you didn't major in biology, I'm guessing then, huh?
Majored in biomedical science, but when it comes to like keeping plants alive or anything like that, I'm the person who, like, the further away I stay from it, the more likely it is to survive.
See, your kids and your pets are alive still, right?
Yeah.
All of my children and pets are still alive.
Yeah. My theory is that I love plants and I have plants in my office and at home. And I sort of joke about, well, if I couldn't keep my plants alive, you probably wouldn't want to see me as a physician. But that didn't apply to you, Susan, just to me.
Fortunately, my patients talk. And I think that's the reason my dogs and my children still like are surviving. But when I was in medical school, we lived in some duplexes, and there were 4 of us who happened to live really, really close together. And one night, 3 of the girls were studying at one house, and I was studying by myself. And so they came up with this letter that they essentially they wrote this letter from the PPS, which was the Plant Protection Society, essentially like chastising me about like the care of my plants, and I was going to have these fees and everything like that. I mean, they had like gotten a letter and like they had put a stamp on it. And of course I didn't pay attention. They were like, "Hey, Susan, we got some mail for you." And I was like, "Oh, okay." I'd come over to like chit chat and visit for a little bit. And I didn't notice it didn't have a postmark on it. Anyway, so I opened it up and I'm like reading this whole thing and I'm like so confused, and finally realized it was a joke. Needless to say, I actually held on to that letter as a souvenir because it was so funny. I mean, it was cute. It was fun, you know. I recently took a snapshot and sent it to the 3 girls that were in our little group, and it was a nice memory. And, you know, like I said, I admit when it comes to plants, you know, I love the house I live in right now because I came into like a mature yard. So like it was all done. That's the best thing for me.
Well, today we have a very special guest. She has joined us one other time. Her name is Dr. Amy Jones. She officially is a scientific director of Ovation Fertility. And so specifically, she is really our go-to person at Ovation for all things genetic. So she knows how to do all that stuff that you read about in the newspaper and all the really cool, neat things that we can do to help bring about fertilization and to find out if our embryos are normal or not. So Amy, tell us what you're going to talk about today.
Well, I think we want to talk about how the use of technology, specifically as it relates to genetics, can help people get pregnant and have a healthy live birth.
Very cool.
So PGT-A, preimplantation genetic testing for aneuploidy, or the abnormal number of chromosomes, is probably the most common thing that we do when we're testing embryos. I mean, there's a whole host of stuff that we can look at embryos for, but that's the most common one. And what is the most common scenario that we would see that for, that you would say it's really helpful for a patient?
Well, I actually prefer the uncommon scenarios, but we'll talk about the common scenarios.
You got to dip a toe in before you push the whole person in.
So let's say you go through IVF and you have 4 blastocysts, and you just randomly choose one to transfer. And then you become pregnant and you miscarry. Well, you've wasted that amount of time when you could be, instead of transferring an embryo that we know will not give you a healthy live birth, you could test the embryos, freeze them, and come back through for a frozen embryo transfer that will have a better chance of resulting in a healthy live birth.
So in this situation, I think what you're saying, that you have multiple embryos, PGT-A can serve as a useful way of figuring out not only which ones, you know, we already know which ones look the best based on what our embryologist tells us, but which ones chromosomally have the best chance of giving us a baby, right?
That's right.
So I have a question. You have a young, healthy patient. So say I'm 25 and I'm going to go through IVF. Why would I want to do genetic testing? I mean, don't 25-year-olds have a lot of genetically normal embryos?
We see rates as high as 50, 60, 70% abnormal embryos in younger patients. Not all patients, but if you happen to be that patient and it takes you, 4 or 5 FETs, if you have a lot of embryos before you find your normal one, it's definitely worth the time and expense to do PGT.
So sometimes I know people are really concerned. You mentioned the expense of PGT. So kind of speaking from your perspective, how much does adding PGT to an IVF cycle run, just as a general ballpark, knowing that we have differences across the country and that type of thing?
Right. So $3,000 to $5,000. And
how much would you say the average frozen embryo transfer costs?
Oh, wow. It's been a while since I've looked at those fees. $3,000 to $5,000 probably also. Yeah.
So essentially, if we have multiple embryos and say we have a 50-50 chance of picking a chromosomally normal embryo and the 50% chance that we've chosen abnormal, we could have already paid for PGT and then known directly for all of your entire cohort of embryos which ones are going to give you your best chances.
Yeah, exactly. And I think the data also supports that pregnancy rates and live birth rates are better with frozen embryo transfers. Patients do better, embryos do better in a uterus that's prepared for a transfer as opposed to an egg retrieval.
So why do you think that is?
Well, you could probably explain that piece better than I could.
So why is that, Susan?
So kind of the simplest way to think about it is when everybody's going through those IVF retrievals, your hormones are going crazy. And those hormones, specifically progesterone, end up at higher levels than what they are ideal for creating the best environment for implantation. And if we can come back in a frozen embryo transfer and have very tight control over kind of the hormonal environment, we thereby get better chances of success.
So, Amy, you said that you were more interested in the unusual causes and the unusual benefits. What are the more unusual things besides the obvious of you have a 41-year-old woman who's going through and doing PGT because she has a higher likelihood of having abnormal embryos and she wants to avoid a Down syndrome child or a pregnancy that's going to inevitably end up in miscarriage. So we've got the obvious, but what are the less obvious reasons to do PGT?
Yeah. So, it's that the conversation that you have with the patient who's coming through, who knows they want to have, let's say, 2 or 3 kids, and they are 35 years old, younger or older, either one. And if they come through and they produce maybe 2, 3, or let's say 3 or 4 blastocysts, of those 2 or 3 are normal. They have a transfer and it's successful. Okay. So they carry that birth to term and now they're a year older. Maybe their ovarian reserve has diminished and the 2 embryos that they have in storage are abnormal, but they didn't know that on the front end. So they waste more time transferring those embryos and all of a sudden they're 37, 38 and they have a much higher chance of producing abnormal embryos and a lower ovarian reserve. So I think those are the patients that I think it's important to reach them. It's important to have that conversation up front and sort of frame it as IVF is such a huge investment and one cycle might not do it. So you need to be prepared that it could take 1 or 2 or 3 cycles before you have enough to produce the family that you have envisioned your whole life. And so if you don't have that conversation, then the decision will be made downstream and you can't reverse that.
So one of the kind of along that theme, the theme in my clinic this week, and I was telling my residents this because my patients have been teasing me that I've got my little ducklings behind me because I happen to have 3 residents in my clinic with me this week. But the theme of my clinic this week has been translocations. And what that means is that instead of having 46 chromosomes, they're paired off nicely. We have the 46 chromosomes that are stuck together in an abnormal way. And these patients didn't happen to know that because they're balanced translocation. So they have the total aggregate amount of chromosomes that they need. And they are, as it's called, balanced. But what that means, and in the case of this one particular patient, she came to me with the intent of saying, I don't want to get pregnant right now. I'm 35 years old. We want to have a baby in the future, but abortion is not okay with me. Like, I would absolutely not terminate a pregnancy for Down syndrome, but I really would like to avoid that if at all possible. And so we want to do IVF with genetic testing. Okay, fine. So we did the IVF, we did the PGT, and her embryos came back. And the PGT testing came back as suspicious for a translocation because they both had this really unique set of missing one chromosome, gaining another chromosome. And they were what's called reciprocals. So matching, where there was one, they were missing the other, and vice versa on the opposite one. And so the brilliant geneticist at Amy's lab put a lovely little note that says, hey, pay attention to this, for which I am always grateful when I see, because if they write me a note, I listen. And that patient ultimately went on to go do a total of 4 cycles. She got 10 embryos, but of those 10 embryos, only 3 were good. The other 7, one had Down syndrome, the other 6 all had that translocation. And we never would have known because the embryos themselves are beautiful. Like, you look at them and they're textbook gorgeous. But when you look at their genetic testing, they're not. And we would have been a couple of years down the road before we realized that if she hadn't opted to do that testing. And I've got another patient with a very similar story, young, healthy, 10 embryos, but in her case, 8 of them are bad.
And we should really track how many we catch, because there's, quite a few of those letters that we send out attached to reports.
Yeah. Well, it's got implications for the kids too. Like the other patient that I saw this week, the only reason she came to me was because her grandmother had told her, yeah, there's something in our family. We're more prone to Down syndrome. You need to look into this when you're ready to have babies. And she didn't know any more than that. But that story alone was enough for me to know what testing to order. She's got a Robertsonian translocation that makes her extraordinarily prone to Down syndrome babies. And
wow.
And so it means that not only can I help her to have a healthy child, but I can tell her exactly, when your kid is of age, this is what you tell them, and this is what they need to be tested for. Because if they carry this translocation, they're going to need to consider doing this testing for their babies too, to avoid passing it along.
Yeah. So I'm curious, have you guys seen a shift in patients who approach you about this type of testing versus 10 years ago?
In my practice, almost everybody, there's a few exceptions, but almost everybody does PGT-A in my practice. And I know that varies from practice to practice. There's some practices that don't do hardly any. I generally pose it as we are gathering more information. And like we talked about earlier, I talk about, if we're wrong one time and we select one embryo that would have been chromosomally abnormal, you would have paid for the PGT-A. I think that, the nice thing is I think PGT-A is one thing that hasn't really increased in price and may have decreased some over the past 10 years. I think the accuracy, I think we trust the data more than ever. Now, the data we get now can be a little more confusing because as we've gained information, now we add information about mosaicism and things like that I didn't worry about 10 years ago because we honestly didn't know we needed to pay that much attention to it. But I think I always consider there's power in knowledge, and some people choose not to have that knowledge, and that's okay. But I think that there's definitely some benefit. I think the hardest conversation I have with patients with PGT are the people who go through an egg retrieval. They end up with one embryo on day 3, if we're still looking at day 3. And, those are the people that are like, I have one embryo. Do I test it? I know what I say, but Amy, what are your thoughts from kind of the lab standpoint of that one embryo on day 3, if you're looking at day 3?
I think it's definitely worth testing, because if you don't test it, then you're going to pay for a thaw and a transfer if it's abnormal. So I think definitely think it's worth testing.
So I have kind of one other question before we close, because we kind of jumped right in, and we kind of all know that of the gametes involved, both sperm and egg, that unfortunately for us females, that the egg is kind of usually to blame for aneuploidy, or for the abnormal number of chromosomes. So can you speak a little bit to the physiology of us females and why that's the case? And kind of, we alluded to it earlier, but kind of the difference in age, if you're 25 or 35 or 45, in terms of your chances for aneuploidy.
Yeah, I actually have the combined Ovation stats for the different age groups. If you'd like me to go over some of that.
Yes, please.
Yes, that'd be awesome.
How many questions? There are a few questions there. So
tell me why being female makes it more likely for you to be, or for your egg to be, the reason why the chromosome number is imbalanced. Why does the sperm not do that usually?
Well, the sperm are reproduced every 70 days or so. And eggs, the theory seems to go back and forth. But right now, I think that everyone's somewhat in agreement that we're born with all that we're going to have. Regardless, the eggs are sitting around in our bodies for longer than sperm are. And there's pretty complicated mechanisms that contribute to chromosomes getting sticky, but basically they just don't separate like they should.
So let me interrupt. So when I go to ovulate, the egg comes out, and all of a sudden, correct me if I'm wrong, but it has to get rid of half of its chromosomes, right? So it can join with the sperm.
Yeah.
That's kind of the issue, right? Doesn't happen so well.
Yeah. That's so when you get that HCG shot and you're going through IVF, that causes the little communications that are sticking into the egg to pull out, and that tells the egg to extrude its first polar body, which is that extra set. And then it has another extra set to get rid of once it's fertilized.
So if it gets rid of too few or too many and the sperm joins with it, then the embryo itself ends up having too few or too many chromosomes, correct?
That's right.
Amy, once in a while, I have patients who really want kind of proof. Did this happen because of the sperm or because of the egg? Where is the technology on that?
So we're getting closer. We would have to have parental DNA to be able to do investigations. The limitation really is how we amplify the DNA. It's a pretty blunt mechanism for amplification. So it makes it harder to ferret out that kind of specific information. But I'm hopeful that this new technology that we're looking at now will enable us to look more closely at a lot of things, including discerning the difference between balanced and normal translocations, potentially looking at epigenetic mechanisms. That's downstream, but there's, as you know, technology and genetics moves quite quickly, and there's always exciting things going on in fields that don't have to look at such tiny amounts of DNA. So we have to sort of take that and then scale it way down to the amount of DNA that we have access to. And because we have to amplify the DNA, again, it's just a kind of a blunt mechanism that makes the information not as interesting. But as the technology becomes more precise, we can look more closely at.
So it is something perhaps in the future.
That's right.
Okay.
So now that we've interrupted you and asked 6 other questions, in between the first question we asked you, what are the general aneuploidy or abnormality rates if you're in your mid-20s, mid-30s, mid-40s?
So Ovation data, I've got it right here. So less than 35, we're looking at around 60% of your embryos should be normal or euploid. So not aneuploid, but euploid. And then when you get around the mid-30s, it's 50%, 38 to 40, 40%, over 40, it starts to trail off, 20%, 41 to 42, and then over 42, you have a real risk of, in any of these age groups, you have a risk of having no euploid embryos.
Well, we appreciate your time today, and to our audience, thanks for listening, and tune in next week for more. Also, be sure to subscribe and leave us a review in iTunes. We'd really love to hear from you.
Thank you so much to everyone for listening, and thank you so much to Amy for joining us. We appreciate it. We'll see y'all next week.
Bye, everybody.
Bye, everybody.